The old man's hands were cracked and weathered as tree bark as he hammered the final beam into place above his underground pantry. His neighbors called him crazy, said he was wasting timber on paranoia. But Walter Hutchins had lived through 73 Colorado winters, and he knew something they didn't. Nature doesn't negotiate. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more incredible tales of survival, ingenuity, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from a lifetime of experience, hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you real stories about real people who lived by their own rules and survived against all odds. Your subscription costs nothing, but it means everything to us. Welcome to the family. The following story is presented as a narrative reconstruction. Walter Hutchins never owned a computer, never carried a cell phone. His watch had been his father's, wound by hand every morning at 5 a.m. sharp. The year was 2019, and while his neighbors in the small mountain community of Silver Peak, Colorado, installed smart thermostats and ordered groceries through apps they couldn't quite figure out, Walter did things the way his grandfather had taught him, with his hands, his back, and his brain. The pantry had been his project for 2 years, not the fancy kind you'd see in magazines with labeled mason jars arranged by color. This was a room carved into the hillside behind his property, 8 feet deep into the mountain itself. Walter had dug it with a pickaxe and shovel, hauling out rocks in a wheelbarrow so old the wheel squeaked like a dying crow. His son had offered to rent him an excavator. Walter had declined. A man should know every inch of what he builds, should feel the earth resist his shovel, should understand the weight of what he's asking the mountain to hold. The first roof went up in late summer of 2018. Solid timber beams, 8 inches thick, covered with planks Walter had milled himself from pine trees that had fallen in a storm 3 winters prior. He'd let the wood season for years, knew exactly which pieces would bear weight without bowing, which knots would hold, and which would split. Over the planks went a thick layer of tar paper, then 2 feet of packed earth, then sod he'd transplanted from the meadow below his house. Everyone said it was beautiful, ingenious even. The pantry stayed cool in summer, above freezing in winter. By October 2018, Walter had it filled. 200 mason jars of tomatoes, green beans, peaches, and pickles he'd put up himself. Sacks of potatoes, onions, and carrots buried in sand. Smoked venison hanging from hooks in the ceiling. Dried herbs in paper bags. Wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. Aging on wooden shelves. But Walter couldn't sleep. He'd lie awake in his small cabin, listening to the wind move through the pines, and think about weight. Snow weight, specifically. The kind of heavy, wet snow that fell sometimes in late spring, after you thought winter was done with you. The kind that had collapsed Miller's barn in '93, the kind that had crushed the roof of the old church in town back in '77 before they tore it down and built the new one with steel beams. His pantry roof was strong. He knew that, but it was also covered with 2 feet of earth and sod, which meant it held snow like a cupped hand. Moisture from the ground kept it from sliding off, and Walter had seen enough winters to know that Colorado snow didn't play fair. 3 feet could fall in a night, 5 feet in a bad storm, and if it were the wet, heavy kind, the kind old-timers called Sierra cement, well, 8-inch beams could only carry so much. His neighbors thought he was done, thought the pantry was finished. But on a cold morning in March of 2019, they woke to the sound of Walter's axe ringing through the forest. He was felling trees again. Big ones this time. Douglas firs that had stood for 100 years. Tom Reeves, who lived in the modern cabin half a mile down the road, drove up in his Subaru with heated seats and a dashboard that looked like a spaceship. "Walter, what in God's name are you doing?" Walter paused, axe resting against his shoulder. His breath came out in clouds. "Second roof." "Second roof? Walt, you've already got a roof, a damn good one." "Not good enough," Tom laughed, shook his head. "You planning on a building landing on it? That roof could hold a truck." Walter spat into the snow. "Could hold a truck. Maybe not 3 tons of wet snow." "3 tons? Walt, come on. We don't get that kind of snow anymore. Climate change, remember? Winters are getting milder. Walter looked at Tom the way you'd look at a child who just insisted there were no wolves in the forest because he'd never seen one. Climate change means unpredictable. Means the old patterns don't hold. Means you could get 10 feet when you expected 2. Means you prepare for the worst or you lose everything. Tom shook his head and drove away. Over the next week, other neighbors stopped by. Sarah Chen, who worked remotely for some tech company in Denver. Marcus and Julie Webb, who'd bought the old Thornton place and renovated it with radiant floor heating and triple-pane windows. Even Pastor Michaels from the church in town, who'd heard about Walter's project and was concerned the old man was developing some kind of obsession. They all said variations of the same thing. The pantry was fine. The first roof was more than adequate. Building a second roof was wasteful, obsessive, crazy. Walter listened to each of them with the same patient expression, nodded once, and went back to work. The second roof went up in stages. First, Walter built 4 massive posts, each one a full tree trunk stripped of branches and bark, sunk 4 feet into the ground in concrete he mixed by hand. These posts stood 8 feet above the first roof, creating a protective cage around the entire structure. Then came the beams, even thicker than the first roof, 12 inches square, hewn from the Douglas firs he'd felled. Walter worked with hand tools mostly. A 2-man saw he operated alone, pulling and pushing for hours until his shoulders screamed. An adze for smoothing. A draw knife for fitting joints. His son Michael drove up from Denver one weekend, found his father halfway through the project. "Dad, this is insane. Let me hire a crew. We could have this done in 3 days with proper equipment." Walter was notching a beam with a chisel, working with the kind of precision that comes from decades of practice. Could have it done wrong in 3 days, you mean? What's wrong with doing it the modern way? Modern way uses manufactured beams rated for average loads. Modern way uses screws and metal brackets that'll rust in 20 years. Modern way is designed by engineers who've never spent a winter in the mountains, who run their calculations and trust their computers and never bother to ask what happens when nature decides to show them something new. And your way is better? Walter set down his chisel, looked at his son. My way, I know every joint, every beam. I know which wood came from which tree, which side faced the sun, where the knots are, where the grain runs true. When that snow comes, and it will come, I'll know exactly what this roof is doing, exactly how it's holding, because I built it with my own hands and my own knowledge, Michael sighed. He'd heard this speech before, in different forms, about cars that were too complicated to fix, about phones that tracked your every movement, about a world that had forgotten how to do things the simple way, the reliable way, the way that didn't require an instruction manual written in 3 languages and a customer service number you could never get through to. But he also knew better than to argue with his father. Walter Hutchins wasn't stubborn. That wasn't the right word. He was convicted. He'd lived his principles for 7 decades, and they'd served him well. His cabin had no mortgage because he'd built it himself and paid cash for the land. His truck was 40 years old and ran perfectly because he maintained it with religious devotion. He owed nothing to anyone, depended on no systems he couldn't control, and slept soundly because of it. The second roof took 3 months to complete. By June of 2019, it stood finished, a massive structure of timber and engineering that looked like it had been built to house a cathedral, not protect a pantry. The beams were fitted with wooden pegs, no metal whatsoever, joined with traditional mortise and tenon joints that had held buildings together for thousands of years. The roof itself was pitched steep, 45 degrees, covered with hand-split cedar shakes Walter had made during the long evenings of spring. Between the first and second roof was a gap of 8 feet, an airspace that would prevent the weight of snow on the second roof from ever reaching the first. The lower roof protected the pantry from earth moisture and seasonal temperature swings. The upper roof would shed snow like water off a duck's back and protect everything below from the crushing weight of a bad winter. It was, by any measure, Over-engineered. Excessive. The kind of project a practical person would never undertake. Sarah Chen brought her boyfriend up to see it one evening in July. They stood looking at the structure, which rose above the hillside like a small fortress. "It's impressive," she said, trying to be diplomatic. "But Walter, honestly, when are you ever going to need something like this?" Walter was oiling the hinges on the pantry door with rendered bear fat, the way his grandfather had taught him. "When the time comes." "But what time? We've had mild winters for 5 years now." "Had bad winters before that. We'll have bad winters again." He tested the door, satisfied with its silent swing. Nature runs in cycles. Long cycles. The kind you can't see in 5 years or 10 or even 20. My grandfather saw winters that buried houses. Saw snow so deep people cut tunnels between buildings. Saw cold that froze cattle standing in fields. He closed the door, checked the seal. Those winters are still out there, waiting. Climate change didn't make them go away, just made them harder to predict. Sarah's boyfriend, whose name was Ryan and who worked in software development, couldn't help himself. But statistically speaking, the odds of a catastrophic snow event severe enough to require this level of structural redundancy are extremely low. You've probably invested, a year of labor into something that has maybe a 2 or 3% chance of being necessary? Walter smiled. It wasn't a mean smile, just patient. The smile of a man who'd watched a lot of people learn hard lessons. Odds don't matter when the event happens, and they especially don't matter when the event costs you everything you've got. I can live with wasting a year of labor. Can you live with losing a winter's worth of food because you trusted a percentage? Ryan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. There wasn't really an answer to that. The summer of 2019 passed into fall, and Walter's pantry filled again. This year's harvest was even better than the last. A long, hot summer had made the tomatoes especially sweet, and the green beans had produced so heavily he'd given away bushels to neighbors who'd helped with the haying. The venison was from a buck he'd taken in October, a clean shot at dawn, the meat smoked over apple wood in a smokehouse he'd built 30 years prior. Everything in that pantry represented work, real work, the kind that left your hands sore and your back aching and your mind satisfied. November brought the first snows, light dustings that melted by afternoon. The kind of snow that made tourists drive up from Denver to take pictures of the mountains. The kind that made people feel like winter would be gentle this year, manageable, nothing to worry about. Walter watched those early snows with the eye of a man reading signs in a language most people had forgotten. The snow was dry, crystalline. The temperature patterns were erratic. Warm days followed by bitter nights. The jet stream was doing something unusual. He could feel it in the way the wind moved, the way the clouds formed. He mentioned it to Tom Reeves one afternoon when Tom stopped by to borrow a chainsaw. "Going to be a hard winter," Tom laughed. "Walt, you say that every year." "Been right most years, too. The Weather Channel says it's going to be mild, El Niño pattern or something." Walter handed him the chainsaw, a perfectly maintained steel that was older than Tom. "Weather Channel looks at satellites and computer models. I look at the sky. Been doing it for 73 years. Trust what you want, but I'm telling you, this winter's going to bite." December proved Walter right, at least partially. The snow came heavy and steady, 3 feet by Christmas, then another 2 feet by New Year's. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make people work at living. Driveways needed plowing. Roofs needed clearing. Pipes needed protecting. The kind of winter that reminded soft people that nature still had teeth. But it was also the kind of winter that made people feel competent. They'd prepared adequately. Their modern homes with their good insulation and efficient heating systems were handling it fine. Their 4-wheel drive vehicles with their traction control and heated steering wheels made the snowy roads manageable. This was why you bought good equipment, paid for quality, invested in modern solutions. Walter's obsessive double roof structure seemed more excessive than ever. Sarah Chen mentioned it to Julie Webb at the small grocery store in town. Have you seen Walter's pantry lately? That second roof is completely unnecessary. We got, 4 feet of snow? And it's not even putting stress on anybody's regular roofs. Julie nodded. Marcus was saying the same thing. He thinks Walter's gotten paranoid in his old age, building things he doesn't need because he's afraid of worst-case scenarios that aren't going to happen. It's sad, really. All that work for nothing. What they didn't know, what nobody except Walter knew, was that he'd been watching the weather patterns with growing concern. The snow was heavy, yes, but that wasn't what worried him. What worried him was the temperature. It had stayed consistently cold, well below freezing since mid-December. No thaws, no warm spells, no Chinook winds to melt things down and reset the snowpack. The snow was accumulating, layer upon layer, compressing under its own weight, turning from powder to something denser. And the forecasts, not the cheerful ones on the Weather Channel, but the technical ones he had his son print out from NOAA when Michael visited for Christmas, showed something unusual developing. A low-pressure system was forming in the Pacific, big and slow-moving, and it was going to collide with an Arctic air mass that had been sitting over Canada for weeks. Walter had seen this pattern twice before in his life, once in 1997 and once in 1984. Both times had produced the kind of snow that people talked about for decades afterward. He mentioned it to Michael on Christmas Day. They were sitting in Walter's cabin, eating venison stew and fresh bread Walter had baked in his wood-fired oven. Storm's coming. Big one. Maybe end of January, early February. Michael looked up from his bowl. His father didn't make predictions lightly. How big? Bad enough that I'm going to start staying here instead of going to town. Bad enough that you should make sure you've got supplies in Denver. Don't trust the grocery stores to stay stocked. Dad, Denver's got supply chains. We'll be fine. Walter soaked a piece of bread in his stew. Supply chains depend on trucks. Trucks depend on roads. Roads disappear in enough snow. The plows can't keep up if it comes fast enough. Walter met his son's eyes. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to prepare you. Get extra food. Fill your gas tank and keep it filled. Make sure you've got a way to heat your apartment if the power goes out. Michael nodded slowly. He'd learned to take his father's warnings seriously, even when they seemed extreme. What about you? You going to be okay up here alone? I've got everything I need. That's the point of the pantry. January came in cold and stayed cold. The temperature never rose above 20 degrees, even at midday. The snow continued, steady and relentless. Not blizzard conditions, just constant snowfall, 2 or 3 inches every night, sometimes more. By January 15th, the snowpack was 6 feet deep on level ground, deeper in the drifts. People started to worry, just a little. This was more snow than usual. The county was running low on road salt. A few of the smaller roads weren't getting plowed as regularly, but it was still manageable. Still within the range of normal, if on the high end. Tom Reeves came up the mountain on January 20th, his Subaru struggling a bit in the deep snow, despite its all-wheel drive. He found Walter splitting wood, working through a cord of aspen he'd cut the previous spring. Road's getting pretty bad, Tom said. Might want to think about coming down to town for a while. Weather Service is saying we might get another storm. Walter sunk his axe into the chopping block. I'm staying. Walt, if we get snowed in up here, then I'm snowed in. Got everything I need. Tom looked at the massive double-roof structure rising above the hillside. At least your food'll be safe, he said, and there was something in his tone. Not quite mockery, but close to it. The implication being that Walter had built an absurd fortress to protect provisions he'd never actually need protection for. Walter heard the tone, but didn't respond to it. You should stock up. Don't wait. I've got plenty of food, and if it gets bad, I can always order delivery. Delivery drivers won't come up this mountain in a real storm. Tom waved a hand dismissively. I'll be fine. You worry too much. He climbed back in his Subaru and headed down the mountain. his tail lights disappearing into the gray afternoon. That night, Walter checked his supplies one more time. The pantry was full to capacity. The woodshed held 4 cords of split, seasoned wood, enough to heat his cabin for months if necessary. He had lamp oil, candles, matches waterproofed in wax. His water came from a spring that wouldn't freeze. He'd built his life to be independent, and now that independence was about to be tested. The storm hit on January 28th. It didn't announce itself with high winds or dramatic clouds. It just started snowing, and then it didn't stop. By evening, 6 inches had fallen. By midnight, another 6. By dawn, the world had disappeared into white. Walter woke at 5 a.m. as always, wound his watch and looked out his window at what he could no longer see. The snow was falling so thick it created a solid wall of white. He couldn't see the trees 20 feet from his cabin. Couldn't see the path to the pantry. Couldn't see anything but snow. He dressed in layers: wool long underwear, flannel shirt, canvas work pants, 2 pairs of socks. Made himself breakfast on the wood stove, oatmeal with dried apples and a spoonful of honey. Drank coffee so strong it could strip paint. Then he pulled on his boots, his coat, his hat, and opened his front door. The snow was already 3 feet deep on his porch, and it was still falling at a rate he'd rarely seen. He grabbed his shovel, a wide grain scoop, good for moving heavy snow, and started clearing a path to his woodshed. 20 feet of shoveling took 40 minutes. The snow was wet and heavy, exactly the kind he'd feared. Sierra cement. Each shovelful weighed 15 or 20 pounds. By mid-morning, he'd cleared paths to his woodshed and his outhouse. He tried to clear a path to the pantry, but gave up after an hour. The snow was falling faster than he could shovel, and he was 73 years old, not 30. His back was screaming at him, his shoulders burning. He went back inside, stoked the fire, and watched through his window as the world disappeared. The snow fell for 3 days straight. Not in waves or squalls, just a constant heavy accumulation that buried everything. On the second day, Walter stopped trying to keep paths clear. There was no point. The snow was winning, and all he'd do was wear himself out. He stayed inside, kept the fire going, ate from supplies he kept in the cabin: dried meat, canned goods, bread he'd baked before the storm. On the 3rd day, the power went out. Not that Walter had much powered by electricity anyway. His cabin ran mostly on wood heat and lamplight by choice, but it was a sign of how bad things had gotten. The lines must have come down somewhere, maybe everywhere. He lit his kerosene lamps, settled into his chair with a book, and waited. The snow finally stopped on the evening of the 3rd day. When Walter looked out his window on the morning of the 4th day, the silence was absolute. Not peaceful, oppressive. The kind of silence that comes when snow has absorbed every sound, buried every landmark, transformed the world into something unrecognizable. He opened his door carefully, afraid of what he'd find. The snow had drifted against his cabin, reaching nearly to the roof on the north side. His window was half buried. The world outside was a landscape of white dunes and curves, nothing visible except the very tops of the tallest pines. Walter put on his boots and his snowshoes, old-fashioned wooden ones with rawhide webbing, another piece of equipment he'd been told was obsolete, and climbed out onto the surface of the snow. He sank a foot even with the snowshoes, which meant the snow was at least 8 feet deep, probably more in the drifts. He made his way carefully toward where he knew the pantry should be. The upper roof was visible, just barely, its steep pitch having shed most of the snow. But the area around the structure was buried under a drift that must have been 12 or 15 feet deep. The weight of that snow! He couldn't even calculate it. Tons upon tons pressing down on the hillside, on the first roof, on everything. But the structure was standing, both roofs intact. The massive timber posts he'd sunk 4 feet into the ground, holding steady. The beams he'd fitted with such care, bearing the load without complaint. Walter stood there on his snowshoes, looking at his creation, and felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Vindication. Every neighbor who'd called him crazy, every person who'd laughed at his excessive precautions, every voice that had told him the second roof was unnecessary, they'd all been wrong. Not because they were stupid or foolish, but because they'd trusted averages and probabilities instead of preparing for extremes. The real test came on the 5th day after the storm. Walter woke to a sound that made his blood run cold. A deep, resonant crack that echoed across the mountain like a rifle shot. He'd heard that sound before, decades ago. It was the sound of timber giving way under impossible weight. He dressed faster than his old body wanted to move and snowshoed out into the blinding white morning. The sun was out for the first time in days, turning the snow into a field of diamonds that hurt to look at. He followed the sound, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from dread. Tom Reeves's cabin was half a mile down the mountain. Or rather, what was left of it. The roof had collapsed sometime during the night, the entire structure pancaked under the weight of snow that must have been 6 feet deep on the roof itself. The modern engineered trusses, the architectural shingles rated for heavy snow loads, the building codes and inspections, none of it had mattered when nature decided to exceed the specifications. Walter snowshoed down as close as he dared. "Tom! Tom Reeves!" His voice sounded small in the vast silence. No answer. He called again, louder this time, his old voice cracking with effort. A sound, faint, coming from the wreckage. Walter moved closer, trying to see through the jumble of broken wood and compressed snow. "Tom, can you hear me? Walter?" The voice was weak, muffled. "Walter, I'm trapped. My leg's pinned. I can't move. Hold on. I'm going to get help." There is no help. Roads are closed. Phone lines are down. Cell towers aren't working. Walter knew Tom was right. They were on their own, and Tom didn't have days to wait for rescue. He evaluated the wreckage with the eye of a man who'd built things his whole life, who understood structure and weight and leverage. "I'm going to dig you out. Don't move. Don't try to shift anything." It took 6 hours. Walter was 73 years old, and he worked with a shovel and a pry bar, moving snow and debris with a care that bordered on surgical. His back screamed, his hands bled through his gloves, his breath came in ragged gasps in the thin mountain air. But he kept working, because that's what you did. You didn't calculate odds or assess probabilities. You just did the work that needed doing. When he finally pulled Tom free, the younger man was hypothermic and his left leg was badly broken. Walter half carried, half dragged him up the mountain to his cabin, a journey that took another 2 hours through snow so deep it seemed bottomless. He got Tom inside, got him warm, splinted the leg with boards and strips of cloth, and made him drink hot broth from the stores he'd put up. "My food," Tom said through chattering teeth. "Everything in my kitchen, all crushed under the roof." Walter added more wood to the fire. "You can eat from my pantry." "Walter, I'm sorry, I should have listened. The second roof, I thought you were crazy." "Doesn't matter what you thought. Matters what you do now." He handed Tom another cup of broth. "Rest. Your leg needs time to heal before anyone can move you." Over the next 3 days, more neighbors appeared at Walter's door. Sarah Chen and her boyfriend Ryan, who'd run out of food after the 4th day because they'd been living on grocery deliveries and their pantry held maybe 3 days' worth of supplies. Marcus and Julie Webb, whose modern efficient house turned out to be not so efficient when the power was out, and their electric heat pump stopped working, and they discovered their backup generator had been improperly maintained. Pastor Michaels from town, who'd driven up to check on his flock and gotten his truck stuck in a drift and had to abandon it. Walter took them all in, fed them from his pantry. Jars of tomatoes and green beans, smoked venison, potatoes roasted in his wood stove, bread baked fresh each morning. The pantry that everyone had mocked, protected by the second roof that everyone had called excessive, now kept 8 people alive while the county dug itself out from under the worst storm in 50 years. They ate at his rough-hewn table, these people who'd laughed at his methods, and the food tasted better than anything they could remember. Not because Walter was a master chef. He wasn't. But because the food represented something they'd forgotten existed. Security. Real security. The kind that didn't depend on supply chains or delivery services or electrical grids or any of the 1,000 fragile systems modern life pretended were permanent. On the 6th day, Sarah Chen asked the question they were all thinking. How long can we stay here? How much food do you have? Walter was kneading dough for the evening's bread, his strong old hands working the mixture with practiced efficiency. Enough for 8 people for 3 months, maybe 4 if we're careful. Ryan did the math in his head. That's like 2 years' worth of food for one person. About that. Why? Why stockpile that much? Walter shaped the dough into loaves, placed them in Dutch ovens. Because you never know when you'll need it. Because nature doesn't care about your plans. Because the difference between surviving and not surviving is usually just preparation. Marcus Webb spoke up from his seat by the fire, where he was keeping warm under a quilt Walter's mother had made 60 years prior. I thought I was prepared. I had a generator, backup batteries, all the modern equipment, but none of it mattered when it got cold enough and the snow got deep enough. Modern equipment is good, Walter said, not unkindly, but it's only good within certain parameters. Works fine 99% of the time. Problem is, life isn't lived in the 99%. Life is lived in the exceptions. Pastor Michaels had been quiet most of the evening, but now he spoke. You know what this is, don't you? It's a parable. The wise man who built his house upon the rock. Walter slid the bread into his oven. I'm no parable, just an old man who paid attention. But that's exactly it. Paying attention is wisdom. Everyone else, myself included, we got comfortable. We trusted that things would keep working the way they'd been working. We forgot that comfort is temporary and nature is permanent. The snow began to melt on the 10th day. Not quickly. It would be weeks before the roads were fully passable, but enough that people could start moving around, assessing damage, beginning the long process of recovery. Tom's leg was healing well enough that he could get around on crutches Walter had fashioned from tree branches. The others had regained their strength, their bodies adjusting to the physical work of mountain living without modern conveniences. Sarah and Ryan were splitting wood for Walter's stove, a task Ryan had never done in his life but was learning with surprising aptitude. Marcus was helping Walter clear snow from the pantry access. Julie was inside baking bread using Walter's starter, which he'd kept alive for 30 years. They'd become a community by necessity, but something deeper had happened too. They'd remembered something. On the 15th day, the first snowmobile from town made it up the mountain. The rider was shocked to find everyone alive and well-fed, gathered around Walter's table eating venison stew and fresh bread. He'd come expecting to find people in desperate straits, maybe dead from exposure or starvation. Instead, he found what looked like a family dinner. County sent me to check on folks, the rider said, accepting a bowl of stew. Most of the mountain communities have been hit hard. People trapped, running out of food, hypothermia cases. You all doing okay? Tom Reeves, hobbling on his crutches, laughed. A real laugh, the first one in 2 weeks. We're doing more than okay. Walter here saved our lives. The rider looked at Walter, who was ladling more stew. How'd you manage that? Had food stored, had a good roof over it. That structure out back, the one that looks like a fortress? That's the one. The rider shook his head in amazement. Damn thing probably cost you a year's work. About that. Worth it? Walter looked around his cabin at the faces gathered there. People who'd mocked his preparations, who'd called him paranoid and excessive and crazy, who now understood what he'd always known. That preparation isn't about being afraid. It's about being responsible. That redundancy isn't waste. It's insurance. that the old ways aren't inferior to the new ways. They're just different, and sometimes different is exactly what you need. Yeah, Walter said quietly. It was worth it. 3 weeks after the storm, when the roads were finally clear and people could return to their homes or what was left of them, they gathered one last time at Walter's cabin. Tom's leg was set properly now by a doctor who'd made it up from town. Sarah and Ryan had decided to move back to Denver. Mountain living had proven more real than they were ready for. Marcus and Julie were going to rebuild, but differently this time, with more emphasis on independence and less on modern efficiency. They stood outside, looking at the double-roof structure that had saved them all. The second roof that everyone had called unnecessary now stood as a testament to something they were only beginning to understand. "I'm going to build one," Marcus said. "Not as big as yours, maybe, but the same principle. 2 roofs, over-engineered, built to survive the exceptions." Walter nodded. "Good, but don't build it like mine. Build it for your situation, your land, your needs. The point isn't to copy what someone else did. The point is to think it through yourself. Will you help me? Teach me how? If you want to learn the old way, with hand tools and patience and understanding the wood, then yes, I'll teach you." They left over the course of the day, and Walter's cabin grew quiet again. He preferred it that way, truth be told. The solitude suited him. But something had changed, even if just slightly. His neighbors understood now, not just intellectually, but in their bones, in their bellies, in the memory of what it felt like to be truly dependent on someone else's preparation. That spring, Walter saw Marcus begin his own project, a smaller version of the double-roof pantry, built with Walter's guidance but Marcus's own hands. Tom Reeves, his leg healed, started putting up food in mason jars, learning the old methods of preservation. Even Sarah and Ryan, before they moved to Denver, stopped by to thank Walter and to ask for his sourdough starter, which they promised to keep alive. Walter stood on his porch one evening in May, watching the sun set over the mountains, and allowed himself a small smile. The world would keep changing. Technology would keep advancing. People would keep trusting in systems and supply chains and the assumption that tomorrow would be like today. And most of the time, they'd be right, but some of them now knew better. Some of them had learned the lesson his grandfather had taught him 70 years ago, that the wise man builds for the storm while the sun is still shining, and builds stronger than he thinks he needs to, because nature always has one more surprise waiting. The double roof stood behind his cabin, massive and solid and completely unnecessary 99% of the time. But for that 1%, for that Colorado blizzard that buried the mountain and crushed modern roofs and separated the prepared from the unprepared, it had been exactly enough. And that, Walter thought, was the whole point of building things right in the first place.